You guys loved the Cuphead vs. Hollow Knight video, and I had a couple extra hours last night, so we are going to tackle probably a bit more fair comparison battle.
Hollow Knight vs. Ori, Will of the Wisps.
Why Ori 2 and not 1 or both? Well, because the second game shares a lot more in common with Hollow Knight, but more importantly, at least for me, there's no reason to go back to Ori 1, as Ori 2 just feels like an upgrade in every way. It's not like they are separate characters and play differently, like how, say, Hornet vs. the Knight will control. So going back to Ori 1 just feels like a big downgrade in both combat, platforming, world design, and to be honest, I even like the story in 2 more. Obviously, neither Ori is a bad game. It's just up to your preference. Side note, if you want to watch a really good video on the whole is Ori 2 a ripoff of Hollow Knight, I suggest checking out this video by my father, Mossbag. Alright, so the fact that these are both side-scrolling Metroidvanias means that we can be more specific in the categories. Bear in mind that some comparisons might be deemed unfair, but if it's in the video, that means it's my opinion. Feel free to debate with me in the comments.
I'm always watching.
Let's get started with one of the hardest to compare, and that's art direction. Hollow Knight has a 2D hand-drawn aesthetic, while Ori has beautiful sprites displayed on a background in 2.5D animation. By discussing art direction, I feel there's more of an argument to be made than just in pure art style. So what do I mean by art direction? Well, for starters, let's talk about Hollow Knight. I would say a huge factor, like one of the most important reasons it's become so popular, is due to its art direction. It's simple, yet perfectly displayed. It gives the player exact information at any given time, and most importantly, it allowed them to make their story and lore seem perfectly reasonable and plausible. You can tell Hollow Nest is an old dead kingdom. You can tell that the city used to be a busy place, and the Queen's Gardens is perfectly represented as a royalty's getaway that's become overgrown. Hollow Knight's art direction is what allows something as simple and honestly silly as a story about bugs take the dark and twisted turns it does and not feel cheesy. So does Hollow Knight win? Not exactly. You see, Ori also kills it in the art direction department. Naturally, they had an entire first game to refine it, but by the time we get to Will of the Wisps, it's basically flawless. You are beautifully represented as a woodland-type spirit in tune with nature, and the environments are effortlessly crafted to fit their role and feel alive and reactive to your presence. Some of the views in Ori are just mind-blowing, and this is one of the few games where I would say 2.5D is actually a good thing. Everything I said about Hollow Knight can be said here, as both games' art direction perfectly fits the tone, story, and gameplay they are going for. If this was simply art style alone, I would give it to no question, which is why I said art direction, so I could give myself a cop-out and say for this category, it's a tie. Another extremely difficult category. Christopher Larkin absolutely slays the Hollow Knight soundtrack. With some of the DLC songs hitting so hard, it reminds me of when your mom and I could easily tell you exactly where each song in the soundtrack plays during the game. For Ori, I honestly think the soundtrack is better overall. I can't really place each track, but bear in mind I've only played Ori 2 once, and while hard mode did extend my playtime some, it's not really that large of a game, so less time was spent in each area. This, however, does not detract from the fact that each song perfectly accomplishes its task in-game. The chase scene songs are famous for making you feel the intensity and peril, and when the story wants to evoke an emotion from you, the soundtrack helps accomplish this effortlessly. Now, I know you might be yelling at your screens that it's
unfair because Ori had a full orchestra and Hollow Knight had one guy.
And yes, that's totally fair, and I have to admit just how good Larkin's abilities are that I'm matching him against an entire orchestra. And Silk Song might be deemed a more fair comparison, but I'm just thinking about the songs side by side, and I prefer Ori and the Will of the Wisps soundtrack more. As we get further into the comparisons, things will start to become easier, but for now, when we talk about movement and character control,
that's a tough one.
The Hollow Knight moveset is almost perfectly utilized. It's very standard tech: dash, super dash, double jump, wall climb, and one of the best, most fun mechanics to ever be used in a game, the nail pogo. And in combat situations and boss fights, you really can feel just how precise, deliberate, and smooth it feels to play as the Knight, and use those moves in a combat situation. The problem is that the Knight is only ever required to use their movement for platforming in the White Palace and Path of Pain. Exploration is usually just a few jumps or wall climbs and a super dash. Ori, on the other hand, is designed with movement and platforming in mind from the start. You get some of the same abilities, although you can get like triple air dash and jump, and you get access to the bash, which is a really fun and unique type of movement tech. Every area has its platforming challenges, and by the time you reach endgame, you are zipping and grappling around so fast that it feels perfect. So while I think both characters feel amazing to play, Ori does a better job of implementing that movement into the world, and feels overall more fluid to control based around that design. Something I am looking forward to in Silk Song is the increased amount of platforming diversity. I'll get straight to the point on this one. Ori 2's combat feels like wasted potential. Yes, there are awesome combos and air juggling and different weapon types, and you even have a pogo of sorts, and combat feels great. But there is nothing to fight. I can think of like 5 total combat rooms, and then you have 4 really short combat wave trials. But by the time you have everything unlocked, there's nothing to do. You probably already know how much I love Hollow Knight's combat, and one of the big reasons is because they actually give you encounters, and when you finally unlock your full moveset, you have an entire endgame arena dedicated to proving your mastery and unleashing your skill. Ori feels like they spent too much time designing the combat and not enough time giving players opportunities to fully explore it. Ori also has a similar badge system to Hollow Knight's Charms, which tries to give even more depth to its combat and player variety, but again, it's kind of pointless. This leads us into another aspect of combat with bosses, and again, it's not even close. Ori 2 has 6 bosses. They are fun fights and pretty epic, but it's 6, compared to Hollow Knight's 40 plus. Again, this is a huge flaw in Ori 2 that there is nothing to fight, and there's no endgame to really test your skills as a player. Hollow Knight has the Pantheons and the Colosseum, which are both optional ways of allowing people that love the combat to really test themselves, while also letting people who just want the game to be over with ignore it. Some people want shorter experiences, and that's totally fine. But for me, if I find a game I love, then I want to be challenged to play it at the highest level, and Ori just does not give me that experience. Some of you are probably saying,
Well, it's not designed to be a game about combat and boss fights. It's a platforming game.
well, if so, then why did they spend so much time detailing a really fleshed out skill-based combat system? It's just really odd because Ori 2 was marketed to be the best modern Metroidvania, and they took so many good ideas from Hollow Knight, but never fully capitalized on them. Hollow Knight wins again. Disclaimer, at this point I'm going to sound like I'm dunking on Will of the Wisps, but just realize I love Ori 2. It's a fantastic game. There's just so much potential that feels like wasted opportunities. Both games have really good lore, but I will say that while I enjoyed Ori's story, my preferred way of developers telling their game's narrative is the out of the player's way approach. The more dialogue and cutscene heavy a game is, the quicker I lose interest. For me, a game's story is at its best when it tells the player what they need to know through environmental detail and references. Exploring and learning a story through gameplay and attention to details just works better for me than having control taken away every hour for a scripted cutscene event, and Hollow Knight just does this better. I also generally just prefer the grimdark mysterious setting type over the somewhat high fantasy fairies in a forest story. So for me, Hollow Knight wins, but I have to give credit to Ori for its masterful way of tugging at the heartstrings at the perfect beats. Both games lean heavily on the Metroidvania aspects, but honestly, Ori 2 felt very linear to me and constricted. And while backtracking was breezy and fast thanks to the movement, I never really found as much enjoyment in Ori's areas as I did in exploring one of the dozens of paths that seemed open to me at almost all moments of Hollow Knight. Metroidvanias are largely about giving players the freedom to explore and satisfy their curiosity, and I think Hollow Knight not only does it better, but it just has so much more to discover. I think Ori has some really cool ability gates like the grapple hook, bash, and digging mechanic. It just feels more like a Zelda where one ability unlocks the area where you get the next ability which unlocks the next, rather than the feeling of wow, I just got this new ability and can think of like 5 areas off the top of my head to use it at. A big problem with Metroidvanias is that they typically end right after you get the final movement ability, but unlocking all the movement tech in Hollow Knight feels like just the first half of the game. How do you guys stand on this? Which game do you prefer? Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the video,